Hey everybody, welcome back to Video So today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project. We got another fun video for you guys this week because we're going to be talking about the Capcom CPS III. It is one of Capcom's most popular boards, even if it has the most limited library of any Capcom arcade platform, and it is one that Hotego and his team have mentioned working on in the future. But people are curious if it will actually work on MiSTer FPGA and what it would take to get it done, so that's what we're going to be going over today. Before we get too far involved, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But I 100% understand why people really want to see Capcom CPS III come to MiSTer FPGA. For the limited library, it has an awesome set of fighting games, including all 3 entries in the Street Fighter III trilogy, and the hardware is A, expensive, and B, very delicate, so having an FPGA implementation of the Capcom CPS III would be incredible. But let's talk about the hardware on board a CPS III arcade board and whether or not that should and would function on MiSTer FPGA. And the good news is, at least on the CPU side, we are in luck because the CPU is a Hitachi SH2 running at 25 MHz per second. Now, if that chip does not sound familiar, I am sure you played on it before on MiSTer and on other systems. That is because the Sega Saturn has dual Hitachi SH2s on board, running at about 3 and change megahertz higher than the Capcom CPS III. And while the Sega Saturn core is not done as of the recording of this video, it is running very well, and that is always a good thing to see. We know this CPU architecture can and will run on MiSTer FPGA. Not only does it run on Sega Saturn, but it also works on the Sega 32X core as well, because that does share a CPU in common. So we know on the CPU side, CPS III would be absolutely easy to do. That's a lot of C's in one sentence, but I managed to get through it. Now, taking a look further down the line at the Capcom CPS III hardware, it's going to use a SCSI CD-ROM drive, but all that is doing is loading up flash ROMs for execution when the game actually first starts. This is a CD-based system for loading, but it doesn't play the games off of the CD-ROM drive. But obviously on the Sega Saturn side, PlayStation 1, CD-ROMs clearly work on MiSTer FPGA. Now, SCSI is a different type of format compared to more of the bespoke stuff on the console side, but SCSI shouldn't be a problem for MiSTer. Now, you're going to see it's marked as RAM, but there's SIMs on the board. This basically works the exact same way as a Neo Geo AES ROM cartridge, except it has a CD-ROM to load those ROMs up. If you take a Neo Geo cartridge, all of the ROM chips are on the board in and of itself. You plug that in, or you load it up on MiSTer FPGA into RAM, and you are executing the game. What the CPS III is doing is taking that CD-ROM that has the data for the game on it and moving it over to the SIMs, and then when the game is executing, it's going to read from those sticks versus reading from the CD. This was a cost-saving measure to make sure that they didn't have to load up giant ROM cartridges. Shipping CDs and those SIMs was apparently cheaper, although I'm sure not by much. Now, there are a bunch of customs on the Capcom CPS III board as well, and I'm not sure how all of those would function. I know Hotego and his team have been working on reverse engineering them, but it's not as well known as the CPS II. On the RAM side, we're looking right around 12 megabytes, which should be fine. If you take a look at the PC cores, getting something like that generally isn't that tough to do. Now, if we actually take a look at the board in and of itself, you're going to see that there's not that many customs on board. If you don't see a chip marked SH2, don't worry about it. It's just going to be a different branding here, but it's a relatively simple PCB for what it can do. There is one more chip within the actual game cartridge in and of itself with a gigantic battery which suicides almost all of these if not maintained. It'll leak and eat away at the board. It's a very delicate piece of hardware to keep all of this running, but when it is running, it is a very impressive platform. It's got great animation, beautiful colors, nice screen resolution, great audio. It's got everything you need for the type of games that are on this. It was definitely designed with 2D clearly in mind, because that's all that it's capable of, and the 2D that's on the board looks so good and is a generational leap over something like the Capcom CPS II. If we take a look at Warzard here, very strange title. It's got a title in different regions. It is a very pretty game to look at, but the thing about the Capcom CPS III is the library is extremely limited. You get 3 different games. I'm counting Street Fighter as the same game because it's coming from the same franchise, just upgrades, and as far as Jojo's Venture and Bizarre Adventure are concerned, they are kind of upgrades as well. Red Earth here is the one game that only has 1 entry on the system, so you can think of it as having 6 games, you can think of it as having 3 games, but but it is still a relatively limited library, but what's on here is spectacular. These animations, the size of the sprites on the Capcom CPS III are absolutely beautiful to look at. I know a lot of people want to see this board on MiSTer FPGA, myself very much included, and that's the fun part about these type of videos. You can presume as to what's possible. The nice thing is on the Capcom hardware side, there is no loading because nothing loads off the CD once you're done. And if you want to actually buy an original copy of Warzard or Red Earth, it's looking like $1,500 to $1,700 depending on how complete it is, and you don't really want to invest in the hardware unless you know how to fix it, because these boards can and do and will suicide themselves when you're not looking at them. Even the most well-maintained hardware, if it hasn't been resurrected, it is going to break. It's not an if, it's a when. So having MiSTer FPGA would be amazing, because even if you try to buy a multi-board, it is still exceedingly expensive because the hardware is known to be finicky. If you want something like a multi, you're going to be, I believe, around $1,200. If we take a look at the rest of the library here as well, this is going to be awesome on MiSTer FPGA because I think it's a little hard to justify the price of real hardware if you're talking about the game library in the same sentence. I do enjoy these games. I did own a Capcom CPS III. I sold it probably 5 or 6 years ago because honestly, I didn't take it off the shelf as much as I wanted to. All of the loading on the CD-ROM into those sims can take a very long time on first boot. It's hardware that's intended on being in an arcade cabinet, turned on once and run for the day, not something that you pick up and play for 45 minutes, although there are Ultra Sims now that allow for faster loading, but that ups the price of the hardware in and of itself again. That is why having it on MiSTer FPGA would be so great, because we'll have faster loading within the way the game works on FPGA, and you'll definitely have a much lower price point, because if you already own a MiSTer, you're really not talking about any additional costs whatsoever versus the over $1,000 you're going to spend if you want one of these boards. And again, just look at the quality here. This is spectacular, and pretty much these games do not exist on MiSTer. Yes, all of the Capcom games got ported outside of Red Earth. You can play them other ways, but honestly, none of those systems are going to run on MiSTer FPGA. We're talking about Dreamcast and beyond for these games. So to have the arcade originals in FPGA would be a ton of fun. We know the CPU can handle it. We know the RAM is fine. With the Neo Geo AES and MVS core, we know loading in big ROMs into RAM and executing them works totally fine as well. And this is coming directly down to the customs on board the Capcom CPS III. Need to deal with things like the bus, making sure that the RAM can read fast enough, all of those related things. That's where the make or break moment on Capcom CPS III is going to be for MiSTer. Those custom chips and whether or not everything can run at the right speeds. I'm not talking about the processor clocks, I'm talking more about all of the different memory paging and trying to get all that data ingested in at once, because again, all of this data down here, what it can do for the sprites, the background layers, the colors, all of those are going to come off of the other Capcom custom chips on board, and that's what really needs to be researched further to see whether or not it would work. Like I said, I know Hotego and his team have been working on this, but there hasn't really been much of a CPS III update recently, so we'll have to wait to see what he says next. But as we move over to Third Strike, this is just such a fun platform, and I genuinely do hope it can work on MiSTer FPGA. I can't find any data that points to it not being able to work, but then again, those customs are always a black box of information, and until you really start to reverse engineer them and put them all together, you're never quite sure what you are going to find. Obviously, the CPU side of things should be fine, the RAM should be fine, and how the games load should be exactly the same as Neo Geo as far as the concept is concerned. I don't really see any issues there whatsoever. What I really think it's going to come down to is if for some reason the speed cannot be kept high enough for all of those customs to get their data in and out and move everything around, that could be the one stumbling block for something like Capcom CPS III on MiSTer. But if going with what I know, going with the data I do have access to, and just following MiSTer over the last 4 years, I am leaning on the side of CPS III should be perfectly doable. It just needs to actually be done. But again, it is still complicated hardware. We're on the level of Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, or PlayStation 1 in the complexity, and those things always take more time. Sega Saturn's been in development for well over a year, and the Nintendo 64 cores hitting about month 10 right now. So this is not the type of thing the Hotego is going to preview on March 15th and then release a week later unless 95% of it is done in the background. This is a level of complexity over a lot of the other arcade cores we have because the hardware is more complex than most of the things that are on MiSTer FPGA outside of the Sega Saturn era console generation. But I certainly hope it can happen. I certainly hope we see it in 2024 because even though the library is limited, it's got some of Capcom's best fighting games on it of all time, and even though the library is limited, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to play these things potentially in FPGA than to go out and buy a multi. I checked the price in the background, $1,300 or so to get a multi. For each individual game, you're talking about $1,200 to $1,800. MiSTer FPGA, it's around $500. Sure to that, leave me a comment down below if there's another platform you want to see a could it run video on, but I'm done and I'm going to go play some second generation. Bye bye.